Tyler, you are a free man for the first time in weeks. How are you filling your hours these days? Are you just wistfully lingering outside the courthouse trying to find lines to stand in?
I wish I could say that. I'm filling it with the hours and hours of things that I've neglected in my life the past 6 weeks. So I'm playing a lot of catch up. But no, I actually was near 100 Center Street, near the courthouse yesterday for a meeting, and I felt this wistful longing, this pull toward the dingy courtroom. It was
you just
calling
felt
to me.
drawn to the courthouse and the metal detectors.
My feet started moving there. I didn't even move them. It was a strange feeling.
You just hear a voice whispering across the meadows, huge. Just kidding. It's huge trial.
Yeah, and a cold shiver ran through my spine because, as we all know, it was an icebox.
Well, was it, was the shofar lady there? Were there any protesters? They've all abandoned it.
Not a sign. I couldn't hear the blast of a shofar in the distance, the ringing of the bell of the Russian Orthodox seeming man who carried a giant metal crucifix. Where did they all go, I wonder?
The line guys have found other gigs.
We need a where are they now of the line guys and protesters.
I will
montage.
honestly, line guys, if you're listening to this podcast, I would love, so these are the people who we hired to stand in the line so that Ben, Anna, Tyler, and occasionally me and Catherine could hang out.
And to make clear,
in the
it's
courthouse.
capital L, capital G. That is their preferred
it's
nomenclature.
Right, it's Line Dudes. Line Dudes LLC.
Line
for all your
Dudes.
line standing needs. I would love to interview them about what this was like.
Actually, I'm trying to pull up the text now, but within, I would say, almost seconds of the guilty verdict, the line dudes sent out a blast text, I think, to all of their clients, including myself, saying immediately, this is good business. They said, if you had scheduled a line sitter tonight, you'll be refunded immediately. They were very informed. They're very on top of it. And then they also, I think, as good businessmen, then promoted their services for future trials. And they listed a few, and they're like, keep in mind, we're here for all of your trial sitting needs, even concerts. So they were on it. I would say within seconds, I'm not even kidding, of the verdict coming out, they were on top of it.
A well-run business.
Indeed. Very on the level. The line dudes abide. I like it.
Exactly.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Rational Security. I am one of your co-hosts, Scott R. Anderson. Thrilled to be back in the IRL studio with one of my other regular co-hosts, Quinta Jurecic.
Hello.
We are lacking our third regular co-host, but we are thrilled to have with us our frequent guests and favorite stander-inner for one of our hosting core when one of us has to miss it, Tyler McBrien, managing editor of Lawfare. Tyler, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me as your favorite stander-inner.
We called the line
You're
dudes.
so much more than that.
We called the line dudes to stand in. It didn't work, despite their standing. They stand more outside, not in, it turns out. And so we had to do more of we had to turn back to our old core. But we're thrilled to have you now that you have open horizons with your time free. You're no longer having to live tweet anything. You're welcome to live tweet this episode if you want. You have a special talent for it. But we're thrilled you're able to join us because we're talking about a few things that are very much up your alley. In what we are calling, in your honor, the morning after edition, to celebrate the fact that we are all now in this warm afterglow of some major events over the last several weeks and of last week. The first of which is our first topic. Topic 1, a perfect conviction. Last week, after less than 2 days of deliberation, a jury in New York State criminal court found former President Trump guilty of all 34 criminal counts on which he was being tried. He's now scheduled to be sentenced just days before the Republican National Convention this summer, where he is expected to be named the party's 2024 presidential nominee. What does this conviction mean for Trump's campaign? What are his prospects for appeal? And what happens if he nonetheless wins the election? Topic 2, Biden time. Last week, President Biden laid out a 3-step ceasefire plan for Gaza, one purportedly originating with Israel, it's worth noting, sending the clearest signal yet that he is intent on ending the conflict there. Both sides have reportedly accepted the plan in principle, but have yet to reach agreement on the particulars. And meanwhile, Israel's Rafah operations continue. Is this finally a sign of the Gaza endgame, or that the end is nigh for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's government, which is under increasing domestic and international pressure? And topic 3, order on the border, but not the way you think. This week, the Biden administration unveiled a new executive order that will make it harder for migrants crossing the southern U.S. border to apply for and receive asylum during periods of high border traffic, facilitating their removal. Is this move a reasonable policy measure, cynical election politics, or something else entirely? For our first topic, I will hand it over to me to get us started, as I am the one person on this phone call who did not step foot in the state of New York in the last several weeks during this trial. Both you, Tyler, were there for, I think, every day of the trial proceedings. Is that right?
Almost. I missed Hope Hicks, unfortunately, and a bit of Pecker. Very unfortunately. I was sad to miss some of that. But for the most part, yes.
Oh, my goodness. Well, that's still a good record. And Quinta was there for some of the closing days of the proceedings. Is that right?
Yes. I saw Robert Costello get kicked out of the courtroom, which is extremely dramatic. Moment. So I was glad to be there for that. And I also saw the charging conference, which others might have been bummed to be there only for the charging conference. But boy, was I stoked. I'm so glad that I was there for that one. I'm not being sarcastic at all.
Well, I am thrilled to be here with you all because I want to dig into what this experience has been over the last few weeks and to get your first row viewpoint about what it might mean moving forward now that we have someone who is a former president who has been convicted of 34 counts of a crime and appears to be on track to be a candidate for president once again. Tyler, let me start with you just a little bit on the personal level. Can you tell us a little bit about what the reactions were like in New York, and particularly around the courthouse, when we saw this jury verdict come out relatively quickly? I think a little faster than some people were expecting, although we had a few people, I think including our own Benjamin Wittes, who were perilously close to calling it right on time. Tell us a little bit of how surprising it was and how we saw Trump and those around him and others around the courthouse react.
Yeah, you're right. It was a bit surprising in terms of the timing. In the days prior to the verdict, there seemed to be a consensus building among the press pool that we would get a Friday afternoon verdict. What this was based on, other than vibes, I'm not sure. But that seemed to be sort of the prevailing wisdom at the time. So at around 4:20 p.m. on Thursday, we got a jury note saying that Justice Merchan came back. We all gathered in the courtroom, and he said something to the effect of, the jury's not reached a verdict yet. I'm going to excuse them at 4:30. Just going to bring them back in to do so. We'll be back here at 9:30. That seemed normal. Then he left, and then he came back. It was 4:31, 4:32. Something seemed amiss, and then all of a sudden we got another jury note saying there was a verdict, and then it was shocking. It was electric. I think everyone was very surprised. Especially because we had just been told 10 minutes prior that we would not be getting a verdict. So then fast forward, I think we've told this story a few times now. We got, the word guilty 34 times from the jury's foreperson. But I think we've spoken about a bit less the atmosphere to your question outside of the courtroom. So when we immediately left, it was pretty quick after that. Trump stood up. He gave a weird handshake bro hug to Eric Trump, the only member of his family, I believe, present at the time. Left the courtroom immediately. I think he gave some speech out there, and then we all went outside, and the atmosphere was very strange. It was still this sort of waiting, anticipatory atmosphere. It was tense. There were big crowds. They were separated by their appearances. I can't confirm this, though. One looked like a pro-Trump side. One looked like an anti-Trump side, judging by clothing and signs, and they were separated by metal barricades, kind of like a wedding almost, but with a lot more security. But even though we had just gotten what we'd been waiting for 6 weeks longer, there was still this sort of pregnant anticipation feeling in the air that was really hard to describe. And as part of it, we were waiting for Alvin Bragg to give a comment, but the other part of it was this feeling that even though it reached some sort of conclusion, there are still so many questions. There's still so many ways that this could go. So that's the only way I've been able to work through that strange suspension feeling after the guilty verdict.
Well, I want to zoom in on that question about where this goes. Could we have some more data points now than we had Thursday afternoon when the verdict first came down? Not many, and we're not going to get the full set of verdict points really until this summer when we're going to see the Republican National Convention come forward and all the political hoopla around former President Trump presumably still becoming his party's nominee for the presidency. That's also shortly before that is when we're going to hear sentencing get handed down for former President Trump. And then shortly after that, presumably, we will hear the promised appeal by former President Trump, which doesn't seem, barring some particularly extraordinary avenue, doesn't seem likely to cut or doesn't seem capable of being issued until after the sentencing is complete. So, Quinta, let me turn to you on this next question. What can we tell so far about what the next steps are going to look like? We have some Trump reactions. We saw both his immediate outside the courtroom comments. We saw a speech the next day where he very much kind of leaned into the attitude and the position of this being a bit of a sham trial. And we've seen that narrative picked up by by no means all, but a number of other prominent members of the Republican Party in Congress and elsewhere around the country. And we begin to see rumors about different appellate issues that people think are on the table that might come out of this, ranging from questions about the charges being brought and the way they related to underlying offenses, and particularly the intent to commit an underlying crime, to the question of whether testimony by Stormy Daniels about, sexual conduct alleged sexual conduct with former President Trump is prejudicial. Do we have a sense about what we think this appeal is likely to look like and what the other consequences to come out of this action by the jury are going to look like in the months to come?
As was the case when the jury was deliberating, I think there is a lot of speculation from a lot of people who have worked themselves into a lather and basically no good information out there. And so what I would suggest is that everybody, and I'm talking to you, law people on Twitter, should just take a really deep breath and step away from the keyboard, because we are not going to know anything until after the sentencing on July 11th when we start getting the briefing in, unless the briefing for some reason starts coming in before then. But it's not going to happen soon, is my point. There are some things that I think we know. There will be an appeal. I think there are some issues that will be stronger for Trump on appeal than others. There has been a fair amount of speculation about whether the Harvey Weinstein appeal overturning the conviction might be kind of a model for Trump, given that ruling also sort of turned on the trial judge in the Weinstein case, allowing material to be introduced about Weinstein's other interactions with women that was, I believe, determined to be prejudicial. I find it hard to believe that that is going to be a problem for the prosecution here. I don't know, of course, but Justice Merchan was very, very careful to keep things on a tight leash. I mean, Tyler, you were actually in the courtroom, so you might want to speak to that, but that was my impression, as opposed to the Weinstein judge, who I read an interview with a lawyer who, not in that case, but had practiced in front of him as a defense lawyer separately, and said that judge was basically kind of a uniquely terrible and vicious person, which is really not how I would describe Justice Merchan. So I sort of doubt that will be an issue. I think that there's a lot of spaghetti that Todd Blanche, the lead defense lawyer, has indicated he might throw at the wall. I think the best issue for them on appeal might be this question of jury unanimity. So it's a bit complicated, but the short version is that key to the case was this allegation of intent to commit an election conspiracy under New York Election Law 17152. That becomes unlawful if it is done using unlawful means, and the prosecutors specified 3 separate unlawful means that they alleged were used. And there was no requirement that the jury be unanimous on which of those unlawful means were relied upon. The defense tried to get a unanimity requirement and did not succeed. For what it's worth, Emile Bove, also defense counsel, indicated that he was sort of aware that the law was kind of against him on this, but was requesting that Merchan use his discretion because it was sort of I think the words he used was an extraordinary case. So that there's some constitutional reason why you might want a unanimity there. Again, it's very complicated. I will say that Tyler and I wrote about the jury unanimity issue in context of a different portion of the legal theory, although I think our reasoning still applies pretty cleanly, if not even more so. And we came away pretty complicated that at least under New York law, prosecutors were on pretty stable ground in not requesting unanimity. So certainly there is an issue there, but I don't know if they will win it. The other thing I would say is just, Blanche is out there saying, like, who knows, we might try it, to any number of crazy suggestions, including this argument that they can somehow take the case right to the Supreme Court through what I believe is called original habeas review. I'm not 100% sure. I'm sorry. Scott is nodding, so I'm going to go with that. So that will not happen. I can tell you that with 100% confidence. This case is going to go through the New York court system before it reaches the Supreme Court. But
Trump asked them on his Truth Social post.
Well, as we all know, that actually counts as a formal petition to the justices. But so, look, I think that there's going to be a lot of bullshitting and a lot of people sort of coming up with their super clever legal theory as we kind of sit around and twiddle our fingers and wait. But the long and the short of it is that there's just a lot we don't know.
Yeah, this question about this unanimity point is an interesting one because it does seem, from my light reading, not the level of depth that you have or other folks have done, but my light reading, it does seem like as a state law matter, reasonably well settled, at least a good reason to think you come out a certain way. And then the question then becomes, is there a federal constitutional law issue about this and about how you have to articulate the basis?
This is on the jury unanimity?
Yeah, exactly. And so, it is one of these things that we're not going to have resolution of. If we get resolution on this, the normal order would be just at the end of this process, right? You would appeal this all the way up to the federal Supreme Court, or probably to the state Supreme Court or Court of Appeals in New York.
Excuse you, the New York Court of Appeals, because their naming system is insane.
Excuse me. I learned that my first day of law school, and I always forget every time. And then
it's opposite day every day in New
exactly.
York.
And then, then that is the point at which the Supreme Court would take a look at that issue, presumably. But we're going to hear a lot about, and we're already hearing a lot about these extraordinary avenues that, whether it's a 1983 action, we saw one prominent law professor raise the possibility of, which would be quite the twist for Section 1983.
My comment to that is, LOL.
It is that would be a shocker, but as a general cause of action that has more or less died by virtue of this court, but a very interesting twist if it resurrects itself here. But it is going to be kind of legal chaos over the next couple of months to come. Tyler, let me turn back to you on what that means for kind of the politics of this, both small p and big P, I guess, because we're not going to have resolution of the actual hard legal issues on a time frame that in any way interacts with the 2024 election. We'll have sentencing in place. I guess maybe if the New York Intermediate Court of Appeals really steps on it, we might get another appellate ruling by November if Trump appeals in the summer and they move very quickly. But that I don't know what New York procedure looks like. My sense is that for most appellate courts, that would be quite fast. And that, of course, would still be just another level before you even get to the Court of Appeals in New York. And then you have the federal resolution if there is a federal law issue. So it's a long haul from here if people are really going to fight out every conceivable legal issue and colorable legal issue. And the courts are going to take them up. So where does that leave us in the interim? How are we seeing people perceive and interact with this proceedings and this outcome?
Yeah, I think because we have such a long road, long appeal road, as you just laid out, it gives Trump and his supporters maximum room to maneuver and to spin this in any way they want. So I think something you've been seeing this entire trial and even before it up to now, and we will continue seeing, is this sort of heads I win, tails you lose type of strategy where Trump so often and his supporters will seize on a very normal legal procedural thing and spin it into some sort of great, prejudice against him or great slight against him. There were so many examples of this, from just his surprise that the prosecution got to have the last word and go last in summations, and his surprise that Stormy Daniels was about to testify and he had no time to prepare. These are just normal legal things that if you take 2 seconds to ask a trial lawyer or even someone who's watched like a police procedural TV show could tell you that these are normal things. So they'll still continue to do that. And then at the same time seize on some of these, genuinely confusing and more substantive aspects of the case. This jury unanimity question, for example. But the effect is the same, from these very, I'm going to call them dumb points of who goes first in summation and spinning that to some, great injustice against him to, these confusing questions about jury unanimity of means versus, intent, for example. But the effect and the motivation is the same to, I think, delegitimize the entire, proceedings to stack the deck in his favor. So I think politically where I come out is that it doesn't really matter, I guess, what he's appealing from him and from his messaging, because he can, I think, quite effectively spin it in his favor. I mean, we saw this even when the guilty verdict came down, which was pretty conclusive. His fundraising website broke because of under the weight of all the donations and the traffic. So I don't have a very sunny outlook, I guess, in terms of the political discourse heading into and after the election as the appeal winds its way through the courts.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll find out that, whatever judges are assigned to this appellate panel, it'll turn out that they're all, Soros backed or something like that, right? There's there's no winning here.
Well, I do wonder whether because this heads I win, tails you lose strategy, which you described so well, Tyler, is just so indicative of the whole Trump mentality, which is that I can never lose. And if it looks like I've lost, that's because somebody's lying or something is wrong, and I can shape kind of the reality of it by projecting my desire. It's kind of The Secret writ large, right? You read that book very early 2000s and took it very seriously. My sense is that you're right. Like there's lots of data points that aren't going to get any sort of clean resolution, even if people did believe in institutions and they still were able to provide like resolution beyond reproach, which is just not a reality we live in for everyone these days. But even if your bar is much lower than perhaps somebody who's highly critical of government, there are a lot of open questions, things people can make hay of. But I also wonder what that does to the conversation we're having, right? Like, these are all theories and arguments that really play to people who support former President Trump. And those are people who are going to give money. And I think it explains a lot of the fundraising push. But how much sway do they think we have against marginal voters, which is who you're actually competing over in a 2024 election? My instinct tells me it is bad for former President Trump to have to talk so much about bad things that are happening to him and that necessarily involve allegations of his own bad conduct, whether people believe it or not, because we know concern and frustration with him and the extent to which his own political and legal liabilities, literally and metaphorically, get in the way of the policy process. Like there was real exhaustion over that. And we saw that in midterm elections, right? And a lot of special elections that we saw Republican candidates run away from Trump to some extent, not just over baggage about things like abortion, which was a major issue, but also among democracy concerns and then fundamentally like kind of fatigue about this whole sort of attitude. So I don't know. My instinct tells me that this is still that the conventional logic that when you get convicted on 34 criminal counts by a jury of peers is bad thing electorally. And I think that even holds true today for Donald Trump. Am I two rose-colored glasses on that, guys?
No, I think everyone who thinks this is good for him is like, I think the technical term would be high on their own supply. It's ridiculous. Like the people who are like, I'm going to vote for him now harder than I ever would have voted before.
I'll vote for him twice.
Right, exactly. They were already going to vote for him. The people who hate him before still hate him now. And the people who, were sort of waffling either because they want lower taxes but don't like that he's rude, or were kind of, vaguely considering it because he seems like a big, strong man, might be now put off by the fact that, every ad is going to say convicted felon Donald Trump wants to do, X. I just find it really hard to believe that that's going to turn people on to him. And to your point, Scott, I think one of the trends that we saw again and again in 2016, I can't remember if it showed up in 2020. I think it did, was basically every time that Trump was in the news, it was bad for him because it means that people have to face him as him rather than as a sort of abstract, protest candidate or I don't like the Democrats candidate. And every time you have to face him as him, you're confronted with the fact that this is a guy who is weird and hateful and uncouth and was convicted on 34 felony counts in the state of New York. And the more he yells about this, the more it's going to be in the news. And I don't think he's capable of preventing himself from yelling about it. And also the sentencing on July 11th is right before the Republican National Convention. So, in the worst of all worlds for Trump, he is sentenced to some amount of, incarceration. And then the Democrats get to run around saying, can you believe this guy? He's sentenced to, 2 months in jail or something like that. And then Trump gets mad and yells about it more. So it just seems to me like it's sort of a downward spiral for him. There's no benefit to it.
Yeah, just related to that point, what we're seeing is, on the one hand, I think normal. A high-profile defendant who gets convicted is going to simultaneously appeal to public opinion while they're appealing in the courts. So it makes sense to some extent that he's going to talk about the case and why he thought it was unfair. And it also, there's, I think, marginal benefit to Trump relitigating the case in his statements to distract from other policy conversations that he'd rather not have. But I think that marginal benefit runs out pretty quickly, where people get exhausted about just rehashing the Stormy Daniels testimony over and over and over. And I think there was some reporting that even suggested this. I believe Maggie Haberman was talking about it on a podcast where there's some Republican advisors who campaign advisors who are actually kind of annoyed by Trump talking about the details of this case rather than, bigger picture things like the illegitimacy of the Justice Department or the justice system in general, which actually scares me a lot more. But all that being said, I think this constant distraction, constant talk about the trial will actually come back to bite Trump in the end with these marginal voters that we've been talking about.
Enough about what the former president has been up to. Let's go to the current president. So Joe Biden last week made a pretty striking series of remarks calling on Israel and Hamas to end the war in Gaza and setting out a 3-stage peace plan that would begin with a ceasefire, move on to a release of hostages and a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, and end with a sort of rebuilding of Gaza. This was, I think, a pretty striking moment because the president has so far held back from outright saying that he thinks the war should end and has been supporting the Israeli government despite sort of rumblings of discontent from within his administration and a lot more than rumblings from Democrats who wish he would push more harshly on the Israeli government to end the war. But this seemed like a break from the Netanyahu government. And I think the effects have been, as far as I can tell, mostly confusing. There were a lot of stories following these remarks by Biden about whether or not he was putting on the table a proposal that had already been proposed by Israel, but which Netanyahu wouldn't commit to, or whether this was a new proposal, or whether this had been coordinated with the Israeli government, or the extent to which it hadn't been coordinated with the Israeli government, and what Hamas thought about it, and if they liked it or they didn't like it. So I will confess, my head is spinning, and I have absolutely no idea what to make of this. It's clearly a further step by the United States in distancing itself from Netanyahu, but it's not clear to me what the mechanics of that are, why they're doing it now, and what this might mean for the war in the short to medium term. So, Scott, please explain to me what the hell is going on.
So it's all a good set of questions. I think it's something that's being deliberately obfuscated a little bit by all the actors involved because every one of them would like to make it look like it is coming from someone else. I strongly suspect this is a proposal that is U.S. driven, maybe done in collaboration with certain individuals in the Israeli government, but not Benjamin Netanyahu, and not people who necessarily want to be saddled with this politically. In that we have this kind of 3-step plan, right? Like a full ceasefire, both sides release hostage prisoners, increasing humanitarian assistance, then move towards Israeli withdrawal with release the remaining hostages, and then this reconstruction phase, right? Notably kind of absent from this is any meaningful plan for governance. Presumably that's something you're going to have to work out before you get to stage 3 before you really even get to stage 2, because Israelis are currently the ones running the place. A lot of questions left open in this kind of 3-step process. And that's not surprising because the questions left open are some of the ones that are the biggest issues left to be resolved that we know the parties haven't come to agreement on. What I suspect happened is Biden gave credit for this to Israel, without saying who in Israel again, because he wants to make it seem like it came from the parties, and particularly from Israel, who, even though he's become increasingly frustrated with Netanyahu, even though he's become increasingly willing to be vocal and critical of some of the things Israel is doing, still is very much a supporter of Israel generally and Israel's right to self-defense in response to the massacre of October 7th. And in particular, I think, sees his popularity in Israel and the credibility it gives him with the Israeli public, which I think is real, as one of his relatively few points of leverage and political assets in broader negotiations around the conflict at this point, at least ones that are easily for him to bring to bear on the Israelis. To preserve that, he makes this look like an Israeli proposal, suggests the Israelis are on board. Netanyahu can't run away from this because if he knows he rejects it, it's going to look like he's both rejecting something that plausibly comes from Israeli somehow, then maybe Benny Gantz, whoever is actually involved with this, will step up and say, no, I like this plan, and even help to come up with parts of it. He will also be pissing off the Biden administration, who, again, despite being critical, including of Netanyahu very directly and personally, still supports a lot of what Israel is doing and has a lot of political popularity within Israel. So he has to say, which is what he has said, we agree with it in principle, but we think it's flawed. Big parts of it still need to be worked out. And by the way, this doesn't change our end objective of eliminating Hamas's operational capacity. Notably, however, that itself is a walk back, because a week ago, he was saying we need to destroy Hamas. Now it's not destroy Hamas, it's destroy Hamas's operational capacity, which are actually two very different sort of objectives. So we're seeing this inching towards this outcome. And then we see Hamas say something kind of similar on their end, saying we accept this framework in principle, but we need to work out a lot of these details, and particularly we need to move forward towards full Israeli withdrawal, not just kind of temporary ceasefire operations. And that needs to be a part of a condition much earlier. All of these things is how these negotiations tend to go down. Look, you rarely come out with one grand plan that everyone's agreed to in advance. Instead, you see an agreement to a broad framework that then the parties inch closer to as they kind of compromise and try and find common ground and make certain small compromises that are small and technical enough they don't compromise their credibility with their own constituencies to reach some sort of outcome. So it's good you have the proposal on the table. It's good that, frankly, the Biden administration is willing to go public with it and use that as a point of leverage over the parties. Because at this point, that's a risky move if they don't think they can bully them into it. I think at this point, they've done the math and they say, we can bully the two of them into something that looks like this framework and pressure them into it. Or at least that's our best option at this point, even if we're not sure we can do it, towards getting something that is what they want, which I think at this point is genuinely an end to hostilities, despite their strong support for Israel's conduct of most of this operation. It's become too much of a political and policy liability on a variety of fronts and humanitarian catastrophe. And so that's the framework we have now. Now, the real question becomes, can you get those incremental compromises enough? Can Netanyahu somehow reconcile this with his opposition to Hamas in a way that keeps his governing coalition together? If he doesn't, then they become a caretaker government. If they have elections and they lose, which they almost certainly would at this point, and then it becomes a question of, well, can they even enter into this agreement? Can they credibly commit to it? The whole process gets kicked several months down the road, and how you continue to conduct this, the conflict probably continues more or less status quo. Meanwhile, the Israelis are still able to pursue their Rafah operations, which haven't been the kind of massive influx that we saw in other parts of Gaza. The massive bombing campaign has been much more targeted, much more selective, appears to have, more controlled consequences for civilians, a little more reasonable, not the sort of ratios we saw earlier in the conflict, which is all things that the United States has been pushing for and are good. But nonetheless, is close to pursuing a Rafah operation that was a red line for the Biden administration a month ago. So the Biden administration is giving a little bit in tacit ways, but each side is trying to make progress towards the way it wants to see resolution in this way, and then frame it in a way that makes it more amenable to the red lines of all the other parties. So the confusion is baked into the system. It's a feature, not a bug, at least from the perspective of those participating in it. And then the real question is, well, among all this obfuscation, we actually know the steps the parties are taking. At least you can dig into it and kind of begin to figure it out. How much flexibility do they actually have to allow each other to make these steps, and how willing are they to make those steps towards an actual resolution?
That's really, really helpful, Scott, because I share Quinta's frustration that it's been sort of maddening to try to follow the diplomatic threads since October 7th, especially on the Biden administration side, this early on strategy of supporting strongly Israel's actions in public and then saying, but don't worry, by the way, I'm giving him hell behind closed doors and I'm really pressuring him, Netanyahu, that is. So it's been really hard to figure out, the Biden administration's true aims here when, they'll say one thing in one venue and another thing in another. And I think this is also a perfect encapsulation of just showing how hemmed in these two leaders are, Netanyahu and Biden, by domestic politics to an extent that seems, pretty extreme, even for high pressure conflict situations. I don't know if that's an accurate read, but they just seem so constrained and so responsive to domestic public opinion. I mean, for good reason in some ways. It's an election year here in the U.S., but it makes everything so hard to parse.
I guess part of my question also is is this even responsible to Israeli public opinion? Like, sort of, yes, but also there's a huge or a significant swath of Israeli society that's pushing for more focus on the hostages. Like, we've seen there were big demonstrations I know at least in Tel Aviv, in support of taking this deal. So, I mean, Scott, do you have any sense of like what the dynamics are there? Is there support for the deal within Israel?
Well, I think on the Israeli side, it's less about public opinion and more about coalition politics. Like Netanyahu is trying to walk a line where he can make primarily, frankly, I think the Biden administration happy and members of the war cabinet like Benny Gantz happy, where Benny Gantz, we know a couple of weeks ago came out and said, Netanyahu, you got to come up with some sort of plan for what comes next in Gaza. And we're still waiting on that plan, or else I'm going to leave the war cabinet. And that is going to be an event that could well, although I don't think it's certain, precipitate a collapse of the Israeli government. So he's got to keep Gantz in the war cabinet, not to mention other people like Yoav Gallant, who's been willing to break with him on other issues, even though he's part of the governing the government.
A fellow ICC potential indictee,
potential arrestee, exactly. And then you have his own coalition members who are far to the right and say, any sort of compromise of operations here against Hamas, we're going to walk. Oh, and by the way, if you commit to do anything about recognizing Palestinian Authority in Gaza or recognizing Palestinian governance, except for maybe they've worked out some solution where they seem moving towards the idea that like local communities will have some degree of governance by Palestinians within Gaza, but no kind of overarching authority, no relation to the Palestinian Authority. That's as much he's been able to get out of his coalition in terms of an end state about where this is moving. But he needs to keep them in the government too. These are all these forces pulling in different directions that he is walking a very careful line. And the hostages are part of it because you have a very vocal component of the Israeli population that is unsatisfied with the government's efforts to secure the release of the hostages, basically says you sold them out. And that is a problem. And they're incredibly sympathetic. And they are going to be a major driver if this comes to elections and we see a collapse of this government. So Netanyahu is walking this very careful line, and on top of it has his own political and personal fortunes wrapped into it, because staying in government is the only thing keeping him alive politically, and maybe the only thing keeping him out of jail, because he's facing still criminal investigation and prosecution within Israel for various corruption-related offenses. Who knows what his actual motivation is? Who knows which of these complex factors he actually sides with? We know he's a political survivor, and he is very savvy at putting together, being very flexible personally, and putting together very novel coalitions and finding ways to patch together these coalitions among people who otherwise might not agree, but find a line that he can walk that will bring all of them into his camp. And maybe he'll succeed again. That's really the test here. And I think what the Biden administration is doing is putting as much indirect pressure on him to stay on a line that satisfies its equities without openly forcing a crisis in the Israeli government, both because I think they worry about how that will be perceived and how that would play into the U.S.-Israeli relationship and domestic Israeli politics, and because they honestly are at the point where they may not be confident that having to wait through elections and whatever that's going to entail will make it easier to reach resolution on this conflict. I think there's a real genuine concern that it will complicate things. But that said, like Netanyahu himself is being openly identified as a problem. And so they're putting maximum pressure on him and making clear that he's going to take the bag and the responsibility if all of this falls apart. And so, that's the effort. It's just who can steer Netanyahu the most effectively at this point, and how savvy can he be at getting everybody to muddying the picture enough that everybody will agree, oh, you can stay in place. And, meanwhile, the clock is ticking, and it's a devastating one for Palestinian civilians. And that's the real challenge here is all this has to happen. That's daunting in of itself, but it has to happen relatively quickly, or else we're going to have an even greater humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza.
I will say, it does feel like you truly could not imagine a worse match of man to moment. Like, it's actually kind of incredible. Although it's not, totally whatever the opposite.
Are you talking about Biden or Netanyahu?
Oh, Netanyahu. No, I can definitely imagine worse options than Biden. Trump among them. No, for Netanyahu, I mean, like, the guy he's just committed to stringing this out for as long as possible. Like it's kind of incredible. I mean, it's not whatever the opposite of fortuitous is, because, you know, he helped create the crisis that led to this happening in the first place. But it is like he is really the last guy that you would want to be in charge in this situation. It's kind of astonishing.
You know, one other event that's coming up, or maybe coming up because the date has now shifted, is the fact that Netanyahu has been invited now by both parties' leadership in both chambers of Congress to deliver what I believe will be his 5th address at a joint session of Congress. I'm kind of curious about your reaction to that, you know, where that's coming from in terms of domestic politics and the motivation behind it and how that kind of plays into this picture.
I'm mystified. I will say the fact that they announced Mike Johnson announced that he was coming on June 13th, only to then have to backpedal several hours later because it turns out that June 13th is a Jewish holiday, is like, how did you not think of that in advance, my man? Seriously. Like, that may speak to the level of thought that's going into this. I don't know. Tyler, what do you think?
How did Mike Johnson, famous evangelical Christian man, not think that it was the last night of Shavuot? I don't know. I am also utterly at a loss. I see very few to no advantages on either side of inviting Netanyahu at this point. It just seems like such a fraught invitation. I'm similarly at a loss. I think that the Shavuot Jewish holiday aspect of it is even stranger. Why, you know, to announce something of that caliber and to have that kind of oversight is just another shocking subplot to this already confounding story. So I wish I had a better answer for you.
I mean, the only thing I can think of is that the Democrats agreed to it because they don't want to be politically boxed in terms of Jewish constituents who are still supportive of Netanyahu. And have, you know, Mike Johnson and Mitch McConnell be able to say, look at these people, you know, they wouldn't even go along with us to invite the prime minister. But I don't know, man, especially given that I can't remember what Hakeem Jeffries has said about this, but Schumer has been quite sharply critical of Netanyahu recently in ways that are a real break for him, because he's been pretty hawkish on Israel. So I don't understand his thinking.
And even to that point, though, I haven't really looked into polling among American Jews about this, but it seems to me that even among American Jews, the majority of whom I believe are generally supportive of Israel's right to self-defense in response to the October 7th massacre, and even supportive of the war continuing, are still probably majority against Netanyahu, whether he's a real or convenient scapegoat or person to place blame on. People are still blaming him. So I you know, even in thinking about the American Jewish electorate, I feel like even a lot of people who are supportive of the war are still not supportive of a Netanyahu government.
Well, and I have to say, I think this is actually a much more complex formula and political calculus and kind of challenging one than is being is appreciated, because the calculus here is so different for Netanyahu than every prior address he's given. Every prior address, he had a very friendly Congress. And Congress is still very friendly towards Israel on a broad policy point. But you have very senior, and not to mention Schumer, as you noted, Quinta, but like lots of very senior, particular Democrats willing to be very, very vocal and specifically criticizing him. I have to say, I think it's actually a much more dangerous double-edged sword for him than these speeches have been in the past, because he can't count on not having members of the United States Congress boo him during his address, like we see during the State of the Union, or openly, perhaps giving signs that they're critical of him and the policies he's adopted. And that visual is going to resonate very dangerously back in Israel, I think, where Israelis have a real appreciation for the U.S.-Israeli relationship and understand, actually, at least in my experience with a lot of Israelis, like it is rooted in substantial part in bipartisan support in Congress. And this would be a very visual confirmation of a trend that we've talked about on the podcast before, which is very real, which is that U.S.-Israeli relationship is increasingly no longer bipartisan, and that the Gaza war, more than anything up to this point, is really pushing it in that direction, where you're seeing Democrats really being willing to break with certainly the Netanyahu government, even if at the bottom they still say they're supportive of Israel. So I think it's actually a risky calculus for and I'm a little curious whether that enters into the decision to delay this. I actually think Netanyahu has traveled to the United States before on Jewish holidays or very close to them. So I wouldn't be surprised if the decision to push this back, especially several weeks, might be in part to say we need some time on the Israeli side to figure out how we're going to respond to this Biden plan and come up with how to use this moment in a way that's politically manageable. And doing it, next Tuesday, whenever the 13th would be, is just too soon.
Frankly, also, it may be a win for the Democrats because the longer it's pushed back, the more likely it is that Netanyahu will no longer be the prime minister.
Also well, I think he's still the caretaker. I think he's usually still the caretaker.
Well,
even
so
if
just one point. Speaking of the Israeli government and coalitional politics, as we were recording, according to Barak Ravida Axios, National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir announced that his new policy is that Jews can pray freely at the Temple Mount. So that won't be incendiary in any way, and I'm sure everything will be fine.
Yes, exactly. Well, we have a topic for next week, at least, if nothing else.
Well, from one politician trying to stay in office to another politician trying to stay in office. Just kidding. We're talking largely about the same politician here. This is Joe Biden, who this week announced a new executive order related to immigration on Tuesday, June 4th, which was set to take effect at 12:01 a.m. that very night, which essentially suspends entry of migrants who cross the southern border illegally, having the effect of reversing past asylum practices, in which typically, I think before this order, it's safe to say that a lot of that border agents who detained migrants who crossed the southern border would ask if the migrant feared their safety if they were to be returned home. This executive order would effectively end that practice, and migrants would have to volunteer that information themselves upon crossing or being detained in something known as the shout test. And I think it's also safe to say that this executive order, although it has already gone into effect and at the time of recording, is likely to face some significant legal challenges. But I want to first get into what the order actually says and does in effect before getting to the politics. So, Quinta, I'm curious your read on it. What does this order actually say and do?
God. I will do my best, but I should say that this aspect of immigration law and policy is so unbelievably complicated. I was looking at this and I found a chart that just looked like a giant spider web. So I'm going to do my best, but if I get anything wrong, dear listeners, please do let me know and I will correct myself. So if somebody wants to apply for asylum, one way to do it is to cross into the United States, just anywhere at the border, present yourself to a CBP officer and request asylum in these interview processes. Another way is to go to what is called a port of entry. So there's no initial illegal crossing of the border, and apply through a port of entry. And I believe in recent years, the U.S. government has adopted, of all things, an app to sort of streamline this process. The app is called CBP One. It was initially extremely glitchy. I don't know if they have fixed that. But what this order does, my understanding, is that it creates basically a cap for illegal crossings a day. So if there are over 2,500 illegal crossings a day, which is where we've been for Biden's presidency, this policy will go into effect where it will become significantly more difficult to claim asylum if you cross irregularly, so between ports of entry. Basically, like if it goes over a certain amount, everyone has to get funneled through ports of entry / the CBP One app. There are exemptions, so unaccompanied children are among them. My understanding of the specific way that this works is not, as you say, Tyler, it's not like you cross the border irregularly, run into a CBP officer, and they say, back to Mexico with you. What happens is that you have this interaction with them. Previously, as you say, there were questions that the CBP officials would ask that would sort of create an opportunity for you to express credible fear of being returned to your home country, whereas now they will not ask those questions and you have to volunteer that information. And the vast, vast, vast majority of people who go through this process do so without a lawyer. I think there's an extremely limited amount of time if you're going through this process to get a lawyer. So if you don't know that you have to say it and no one has asked you, the odds that you're actually going to, say the thing that you need to say in order for CBP to allow you in and parole you, I think is the right term, until your hearing, are very, very low. So this is not like a, seal the border, no one gets in or out, but it does substantially narrow the opportunities for people to enter the country and claim asylum, if that makes any sense at all. Like I said, it's extremely complicated, and I think I would be curious what, immigration lawyers think of this analysis. I'm still waiting for sort of expert analysis to come out on this, but I do kind of wonder if the fact that this is so tangled is kind of a benefit for the administration, because they can say, it sounds very dramatic to say, we're closing the border, and Trump loved to do that. And so they can kind of appease people who want a more restrictive immigration policy for irregular migration across the southern border. They can get their approval by saying, I'm being tough on this, yada, yada. But then to those who object and say, like I would argue this is a real restriction of right to asylum that has been the foundation of our understanding of human rights post-war. They can say, oh, but we're not shutting it off completely. You can still go through CBP-1. You can still express, if you pass the shout test, you can still get in, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know how effective that triangulation will be. There have been plenty of immigration advocacy groups and rights groups like the ACLU have indicated that they intend to sue, just as they did when Trump implemented a similar policy. The administration is arguing that this is different because there are more exceptions. But overall, I will say I find it uncomfortably similar to a lot of the techniques that Trump tried, and I think is yet another example, and I say this every time we discuss this, of how Trump really, really shifted the public conversation on immigration to allow a greater restrictiveness. And I'll say one more thing and then I'll shut up, which is that I do think it is important to distinguish between irregular migration across the southern border with people claiming asylum and people who are coming in, after applying and receiving a visa. So what the sort of real innovation, or one of the innovations of the Trump administration, was that Stephen Miller essentially wanted to shut both of those off. The Biden administration has substantially opened up this sort of regular migration. It is a lot easier now to, get a visa to come to the United States than it was under Trump. But it does seem like the Biden administration has decided that they really need to pacify the right flank when it comes to irregular migration through Mexico. So that is my spiel, and I dearly hope that I did not get that completely wrong.
So there's two aspects of this I want to pull out a little bit more, one technical and one political. On the legal side, I think you described it exactly right, Quinta. Like, we have this kind of rolling period, heightened period where if we have a 7 days starting now, and if at any period following 7 days of this heightened level of unlawful or undocumented immigration, that's documented by incidents and encounters. So it's not necessarily people crossing the border. It's like done on a way that border authorities kind of encounter people. So I think it includes like when they identify people from a distance crossing and count them, but don't necessarily interact with them on an administrative basis. When we have that level above a level, you have this heightened standard, and that includes what the DHS's own kind of fact sheet describes as a new, substantially higher standard for that these people who espouse this concern about potentially being tortured or persecuted in their country of return or their country of origin have to meet. Now, it's described as a reasonable probability standard, which I think was already the standard under the kind of immigration rules that the Biden administration installed last year for people who had this is the circumvention of lawful pathways rule. That was kind of like an already heightened rebuttable presumption that applied if somebody entered not through conventional permissible means. So I don't exactly know how there's a higher standard, but I know DHS describes it as a higher standard. So presumably there's some additional guidance in the rule, which I haven't seen yet, may or may not have been out yet, but that the interim rule that was released part of the executive order. So that does a lot of the work here. It's notable DHS says expressly, like, we're continuing to abide by our international obligations and commitments. They think this is consistent with that. And I'm not 100% sure they are wrong. Because without 100% having done the close look at the international legal framework, simply because a lot of obligations like this don't come with such concrete things as, standards of review or evidentiary standards. So it's possible this heightened interpretation, they still at least have a colorable argument, or at least one that's not going to get them in any realistic trouble in any international fora, that they're still abiding by that obligation. But I think the real context here is political, and particularly around timing. Like, in my mind, this is very clearly an effort by the Biden administration to capitalize upon the fact that the Republicans killed 2 different immigration deals as part of holding up the package of assistance to Ukraine, among other items, Israel, Taiwan, things like that, that ultimately did pass with Republican support, of course, once Speaker Johnson allowed it to do so. But like the key point here is that they see the Republicans having a major liability here because at the direction of former President Trump, he basically, as reported, said, you shouldn't make any deals on immigration. I want immigration to be an election issue I can hit Biden with. So no deals, nothing to do but make us co-own immigration with him. And now the Biden administration has done that in a way that I think is politically savvy, even if I don't particularly like personally the policy outcomes, to say, nope, now we're going to be able to show that we are actually taking actions individually. And every time we talk about this, we're going to talk about how you have withheld resources from securing the border, and we're doing measures to actually take it and increase it. I think this is significant and a problem, and I don't like to see the burden shifted on to more vulnerable populations, particularly the need to affirmatively assign this heightened standard of review. But I'm not sure there isn't, frankly, like a strong element of political hyping involved here. Like, I think this is a significant step, but I don't think it's revolutionary. It's really more of a continuation of the fact that Biden administration has continued the tenor and many of the forms of the Trump administration's immigration policy and not been willing to move back from them, at least as a regulatory administrative measure. And here is adding to them, but in a way that I think is more marginal to medium than massive. The fact that this will become a talking point, I don't think is surprising for political reasons. The substance is, again, I think significant, but I don't think it's a radical departure from the Biden administration's policy or necessarily from the Democratic parties, the way it's at least been manifesting the last few years, which is one where they have been skeptical of immigration. That is itself a change, but I'm not sure this is a major step beyond what was already being done.
Yeah, I think I agree with both of what you're saying. And I think a lot of these dynamics play out in a really interesting way in the proclamation that the Biden administration issued alongside the executive order. There's this really interesting balancing act that they seem to be trying to play, in which they start the proclamation with this very high level view. And they're like, here are these, massive geopolitical factors that are contributing to the fact that, quote, the first line is, there are more people around the world who are displaced from their homes today than at any point in time since World War II. But then you see them like later on.
And we're not letting them in.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. And so but then you can
and
see
that's a problem for us.
Yeah. But then they don't want to play into this perception of a massive crisis at the southern border, because they then go on to say, from January to March 2024, encounters decreased from and have remained below levels experienced in November and December 2023. So then they kind of back up. They're saying, it's actually not as bad as perceptions are. I think immigration, there is like an especially strong delta between perception and reality in terms of levels of encounters, whatever. But then they say, so actually the levels are lower than highs, months ago, but it's still a problem. And so, and actually, it's Congress's failure to address this problem, as Scott, you were saying. So we're stepping in now to fix this problem. That's actually not that much of a problem as you may think it is, but still is. So it's this weird, this pendulum swinging back and forth, trying to navigate this gulf between perception and reality. But that is interesting. But I do question how politically savvy it will turn out to be, Scott, to your point, because I don't know, part of me wants to say that this is another Biden administration political blunder in which they end up just pissing off the center left or left that make up their base without actually gaining any ground in the center right or right at all that you may have seen in other places like Gaza. But I don't know how it'll play out.
Yeah, I don't think we know. I don't have a great sense of that myself. I do think that, to Scott's point, it may be particularly useful because it allows them to say, we had an immigration bill, the Republicans canned it, and I'm taking action as much as I can, but, there are limitations. By the way, one of the things that was in the bill that Biden can't do by executive order is increase the number of immigration judges, which would really help because sometimes people have to wait 4 to 5 years before their case is adjudicated. And, that kind of increase in resources in a systematic way, there are ways to do that would actually be really helpful. But that is something that you do need Congress for. So I'm honestly not sure. I don't have a great sense of, clearly the Biden administration has made the calculation that this is an issue where they're going to try to neutralize Republican attacks. Personally, I think it is morally wrong, but I'm not a political consultant. And so I honestly don't know. And I'm also not even sure how you would tell, frankly, given how stable the polling has been in head-to-head polls between Biden and Trump. So this might be one of those things where you just have to kind of, go with your gut and see what happens in November. And what that means is that, before and after then, we're just going to have a lot of, very highly paid political consultants sort of vibing and suggesting things that are, in alignment often with the, pre-existing beliefs that they came into this whole thing with. So I'm genuinely unsure.
Yeah, I tend to trust the Biden folks that they think they have an issue they can use as a cudgel here. And all the talking points suggest that's what they're doing it with. And the politics of it, I'll defer to them on. And it makes sense to me. And we do know immigration is an issue that does have, broader salience. While I don't always agree with it, with a lot of part of the American public, including a lot of kind of median, middle of the road voters, which are the people you're trying to win over. I think there's probably some political reality there. And I also think, frankly, this is an issue that because this is being done in a way that, doesn't deal with the visceral awfulness of the Trump administration did with things like child separation, I don't think is going to raise as many alarm bells with the left as certainly the Gaza war with its horrible humanitarian costs and things like that. If I have a criticism here, it's that this whole issue set is one that has really lacked vision for the Biden administration, for Democrats in a way that I think will come back to bite them for kind of 3 reasons. One, coming out of the Trump administration, you saw more American support for more lawful immigration than you have seen in recent memory. That has now kind of ebbed. That was a real moment of opportunity that would have been a good opportunity to maybe make this issue a little bit of a higher priority and push for the idea that really there is a place for immigration in our in our broad national scheme that's good, and we need to increase that. That's in these talking points. The Biden administration talks about it. We should have more lawful immigration as they frame it. But I wish that were a more lean forward point because it's both true. It helps defeat the issue of unlawful immigration to a substantial extent because you can help recast immigration as a positive good for the country, which it is economically and, in my view, socially, culturally, politically. And, by the way, it fits really well with the whole national industrial policy that the Biden administration is leading into, and that to be economically competitive, and particularly if we are increasingly moving away from offshoring production, we need a larger population of affordable labor. And so actually you need more immigrants. And if anything, I saw one account that instinctually makes sense to me. I'll wait for economists to weigh in to know for sure, that noted that if you were to actually implement this policy as aggressively as the Biden administration suggests it might, although again, I think there's reason to doubt whether it necessarily will, then that would actually really undermine his policy because it's going to come with an economic hit, perhaps even within the window which election will happen, although more likely like a year or two out. So, there's a missed opportunity here. And the other missed opportunity I really harp on every time we talk about this issue is that they have not done enough to stigmatize the bottom horrible things the Trump administration did and may yet do again in this space. They have now instead kind of bought into the broad framing of this is a problem and extraordinary action is warranted to respond to it, but without kind of shut down more directly any of the horrible things the Trump administration may yet turn back to in a second term, like child separation. Those things I think have real public salience. I think they're political vulnerabilities for the Trump administration. Hopefully we'll see them capitalized on in the next few months leading up to the election because public opinion is not favorable on them. But the Biden administration could have done a lot more to make those things harder to do in the future, including, by the way, maybe exploring criminal investigations of some of the people who were involved, particularly in ways that really raised serious legal questions, and they were there. But we haven't seen an appetite for that. Maybe there's just no legal case there. Maybe that's not it. But there still are other accountability mechanisms that would have been good to see, including fact-finding missions and, more publicly bringing forward the story about what actually happened, what has been done, which is a horrific story and really a stain on our national reputation that should not be repeated. I think there's real missed opportunity there. I hope the administration, I understand the politics of this, but they need more leadership on this issue. And it's an issue that really is important to their overall vision of where the country should head on a lot of different fronts. And I'm hoping we see, if we get a second Biden administration term, I'm hoping we see a little more proactivity on this whole issue set at that point. Well, folks, that brings us to the end of our conversation for this week. But this would not be Rational Security if we did not leave you with some object lessons to ponder over in the week to come. Quinta, what do you have for us this week?
I have a book recommendation from a book that has not quite been out for a year. It is Zadie Smith's novel, The Fraud, which is about, among other things, Charles Dickens and a super bizarre legal case that I personally had never heard of, where basically the heir to some hoity-toity family was lost at sea. And some decades later, a guy showed up who looked absolutely nothing like him and was almost certainly a butcher from somewhere else in England who had gone to Australia, claiming that he was this long-lost heir. And there was an enormous amount of litigation over his claim, and he drew a huge amount of public support despite not looking anything like this guy and having no evidence. So it's super, super interesting backstory. Zadie Smith, of course, is a wonderful writer and does all kinds of interesting things with it, and sort of zeroes in on one character who I believe was a real figure, who was the free Black man who had been a servant at this family's estate, and claimed that he recognized this person as the rightful heir, even though there was actually no evidence to that effect at all, and sort of drills in on his story in a really, really interesting way. So I highly recommend it. It starts off rollicking and ends up pretty sobering. So, be aware, spoiler alert. But I greatly enjoyed reading it.
Quinta rolling in with another bummer. Who saw that coming?
It started off fun.
Fair enough. Well, I have a fun object lesson this week of sorts, a note from the historical file that I found interesting when, and I discovered in the last week or two, when three of my more far-reaching interests, which is fashion / sprezzatura, which I appreciate on occasion, boats and wildlife all intersected in a crazy way. For folks may be aware, there's been this phenomena in the Mediterranean for the last couple of years where orca whales have been attacking certain sailboats and knocking them over in a pretty vicious way. And as somebody who enjoys boats of all sorts and also one day would love to bring a sailboat somewhere to the Mediterranean, this made me very nervous because I do not want to get in a fight with an orca whale. I've kayaked with them, tried to kayak with them. They really outran me pretty handily before. It would be pretty terrifying. I was scared enough as close as I was and don't feel the need to take them on. But they appear to have discovered what they think is happening. And they think this is actually a set of learned behavior among 2 or 3 interacting pods of juvenile males, where essentially they are able to hang out in the Mediterranean together way more than they used to because warming sea currents have made food easier to get. So they don't have to migrate or spend as much time hunting. So they have a lot more leisure time. And what do you do with leisure time? If you're a young adult male, you just start inflicting violence on random things around you, much like people do. And so they've been taking it out on boats. So they've been essentially trying to play with, but orcas can be very rough with their play, as many a sea lion and seal has discovered in unfortunate terms, evidently before. But my favorite part of the story that came to my attention because of this discovery is when people talk about prior historical incidents of this sort of fad behavior among orcas, which are among the most intelligent animals. And I love stories about how intelligent animals actually are in ways that seem so strikingly human. And that is because in 1987, I think it was the Puget Sound, if I recall correctly, scientists observed 3 different pods of orcas, young adult orcas, male and female, exhibiting the same behavior that appeared to communicate among them like a meme over the course of one season. And that is that they wore dead salmon as hats and placed them on their heads as they caroused around. It is an absolutely phenomenally weird story with phenomenally weird pictures of these orcas with dead salmon splayed across their head, showing them off to each other. But evidently this trend persisted for essentially a season. And then the pods kind of went their own way, and then the trend died because people moved on to other things, and the orcas got busy, and they grew up, and they had kids, and no longer had time for hobbies. And so, I think it's a fascinating story of weirdly human behavior in the animal kingdom, and I thought I'd share that. So I'll throw a link in to one of the articles I saw describing this phenomenon in the show notes. It is pretty wild. All right, Tyler, what do you have to bring us home this week?
I, too, have a pretty amazing story. This one tracking with one of my interests, which is singing the praises of unsung heroes who achieve excellence and help your life out, if that's a theme. But anyway, that's a hell of an acronym that you just threw out there. Exactly. I won't try to repeat that. But I don't know if either of you heard about this, but the Osaka International Airport just hit a world record in that in their 30 years of operation, they have never lost a single piece of luggage in 30 years.
That is impressive.
It's so impressive. And, it's not like it's not a small airport. They handle millions of bags, handled 10 million bags in 2023 alone. But the best part was I listened to an interview on the radio, and they interviewed, of course, the guy who's in charge of this. Seems like a very friendly, affable Japanese man. They were like, "What's the secret? What's your secret sauce?" And it was such a beautiful answer. He just simply said, "Well, we respect our passengers, and they are very precious about their belongings, and we just wouldn't want them to lose it." Which I'm sure was actually very infuriating for anyone trying to learn from what Osaka is doing, but I found it a very heartwarming answer. But I was just blown away by this world record.
That is utterly phenomenal. I once witnessed at, I think it was the Mohammed V airport in Casablanca, if I recall correctly, a suitcase fall off the back of a luggage cart and then watch an airport worker kick it across the ground for like 100 meters, and then only to be told by somebody else, presumably who pointed the opposite direction, that it should go somewhere else. And then he proceeded to kick it another 100 meters away from the cart that it fell off of.
He was practicing for soccer.
Exactly. This was not my bag, thankfully, but I pitied that person that day. So there's certainly some space for some learning in this particular field. Well, folks, that brings us to the end of this week's episode. Rational Security is, of course, a production of Lawfare. So be sure to visit us at lawfaremedia.org for our show page with links to past episodes, for our written work, and for the written work of other Lawfare contributors. And in addition, for information on Lawfare's other phenomenal podcast series, including The Aftermath, Season 2, and now fully available. While you're at it, be sure to follow us on Twitter or X at RETL Security, and be sure to leave a rating review wherever you might be listening. 5 stars, please. Also, sign up to become a material supporter of Lawfare on Patreon for an ad-free version of this podcast and other special benefits. For more information, visit lawfaremedia.org/support. Our audio engineer and producer this week was Noam Osband of Goat Rodeo, and our music, as always, was performed by Sophia Yan. We were once again edited by the wonderful Jen Patchow. On behalf of my co-host Quinta and our special guest Tyler McBrien, I am Scott R. Anderson, and we will talk to you next week. Until then, goodbye.